Hello and welcome back. In this video, we'll be looking at risk and security management. Right, so let's get started. Risk control and management. Well, in the last video, we covered about defense mechanisms, right? And often it is ideal to have all sorts of different mechanisms implemented to ensure that our system's super secure. But whenever you do such actions, there are costs associated with it. And because different organizations or different systems have different priorities, the impact of attack when realized can be different from organizations to organizations and people to people. Therefore, it makes sense for you to prioritize based on what kind of risks you are perceived from your system, right? So, for example, in a news agency, the availability is probably one of the high importance for you to send out information to people, to reach people. Whereas in, for example, government systems, people don't really want to share those informations. They want to keep it secret and also only provide information to authorized personnel, right? So in that sense, the confidentiality and integrity may be more highly attributed and important in that system. So different system will have different priorities when it comes to security. And therefore, when you want to invest in security, those priorities should influence what kind of security measures or solutions you implement them. Okay, so this is when the risk control and management comes in. So risk is unwanted outcome by a potential threat, and when we evaluate this, you assess this with respect to your perspective. Okay, so there are standards about how to do about risk controls and management. So you can have a look at ISO standards, which we will may go over later on. But the cycle is quite straightforward. What you want to do is plan and check what's needed to be done. You implement those, do it, check, and then act on it. So this is the basic 4 steps taken in risk control. Okay. So how do we carry out those 4 phases? So we're going to start from our top left corner over there. Is it right? Or is it this way? Okay. Information gathering. So how do you gather information in order for you to realize what kind of threats, what kind of risk we are dealing with here? Have a think. No, you haven't. Have a think. Okay? Right. So there are items like vulnerability scanners, system settings. All those informations can be collected to start our initial understanding of the risk. So what we want to do is gather all the information as much as possible. And those 2 items are probably the biggest resources that you can start with. Okay. So once now we have information, we need to assess the vulnerabilities that we found. Okay. So how do you go about assessing vulnerabilities? Well, how would you say your computer, how secure is your computer compared to your friend's computer and compared to, for example, the university computer and so forth? Let's have a look. Okay. So in order to compare, you need to know what you're comparing about. Okay. And that can be measured based on security metrics. There are various types of security metrics that can be used, but let's not go over here at the moment. Okay. Once you know what you're measuring, then you need to actually build the model and analyze. Okay. So we need to know how those vulnerabilities are related together and what kind of attacks are possible to exploit those vulnerabilities. So that's the modeling aspects. Then once we build this one, we can apply the analysis to understand what kind of metrics it returns. Okay. So now we understand a bit more about vulnerability assessment. Then Based on this information, we need to apply system hardening. So this is now implementing security measures to get rid of those vulnerabilities. So what kind of system hardening can we do? Okay, well, let's have a look. So you can either do a patching. So you've probably seen like system updates. This applies to all the operating systems. They come out and they say, important security patch, right? So that's what's happening here. They found some bug that are related to security, and they try to rewrite the code to get rid of it. So that's what's happening, vulnerability patch. Okay, a vulnerability patch can come in various forms. Okay? And software update itself can be hardening the system. For instance, you are using one of the very old versions of operating systems. Maybe in Windows, you are using Windows Vista, for instance. Okay, and then you suddenly update that to the newer version, to Windows 10, for instance. Then suddenly, the building blocks, they're quite different. So you may get rid of the vulnerabilities that existed in the older version straight off by just making an update. So as part of the software update, it may include vulnerability patch, but it actually does a lot more than just doing the patching. You might actually replace the whole mechanism with a much better one, which is better well built. Once you have system hardening completed, then you can move on to the intrusion detection and prevention. Okay. So what do we need to do here? Well, in the last couple of videos, we have discussed about this, which includes policy updates and firewall rule sets. Okay. So once the defense mechanism has been implemented, you will also make sure that your policy gets updated to reflect such changes. Because sometimes some of the changes you make, you also need to make changes how the policies are implemented and how the firewalls filter out packets. Yeah? So those now forms a cycle, so you can go back to the information gathering, gather the information about your new system and see what kind of vulnerabilities there are, assess it, and this forms a cycle. So in this picture, it's a flat, but if you put it onto the ground and just make it into a spiral tower, that's what it kind of looks like in real life, in practice. Okay, so now let's have a look at different layers. So when we implement those, in the previous diagram, we were not looking at layers, but obviously computers are made up of layers. So if you've done computer networks, you'll probably be aware of the OSI layers, the 7-layer model. But there are various layer models that you can apply. So in here, we just simplify into 4 layers: application, OS, network, and physical, right? So what kind of things could you do at each layer? Because obviously what you can do on one layer may not be applicable in the others. So for example, application, maybe you can do software updates, okay? Or you can do secure coding, okay? So those are applicable in the application layer. But not always it's going to be attached to only single layer. For example, secure coding, depending on which layer you're coding, it can be applied to other layers as well. We also have sandboxing and virtualization. So this can trap actions within a virtualized space. So if something malicious happens, you can quickly erase that and start a new one, but trying to address some of the vulnerabilities that we found in the previous versions. We can also have some secure protocols, as well as implementing authentication, and at the physical level, typically handles encryption. Okay, so although it's a bunch of zeros and ones, encryption is actually mapped to multiple layers depending on which protocol we're handling with, but we associate encryption with the physical layer. Okay, so that's so going from the spiral one, At each step, you can think about how different layers can implement different mitigation strategies. Okay, and each of those actions will have different variables, like the cost of implementation will be different, the duration of the implementation will be different, the disruptions to the service based on the implementation will also be different. So all of these aspects needs to be taken into account when we adopt one of the solutions. Security policies is a set of procedures and tasks to ensure the security objectives of an organization. So what it means is it specifies what the assets are, what are the assets, and may specify how it is done. Okay, so actually your own computer has its own set of security policies. You may Google about security policies of your own operating system. Then it has a long list of security policies already applied to ensure that your computer is secure against some of the external attacks. However, these policies can always be changed, and you can customize this based on your needs as well. So to produce the policy, you need to know what the assets to be protected. So what is the important things that you're trying to protect? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the threats? And how we can mitigate? So you can see that there's some pattern here where some of the previous steps that we have gone over is also applied in this instance when we are trying to come up with security policies. Okay? So basically it's about understanding security requirements, and they are a critical step towards formulating the security policy. Okay, so we need to know what we need as security in order for us to come up with security policies. Okay, so for example, about passwords, obviously it could be a single character all the way up to how many you want to set, but often you don't use anything less than 8 characters. Nowadays it's getting longer. Some login restrictions are asking at least 10 characters and things like that. You need to have like special characters, upper letters, uppercase or lowercase, special frequency of changes, where you are logging in, etc. So all those things are part of the security policy. It has been implemented as a policy for you to follow. Okay. So now it comes to security management. So this is now looking at overview of how to manage security. There are different standards to achieve this, but these are generic ways of looking at this. Risk control and security policy development is a part of security management. So all the things that we have just talked about before falls as part of the security management. You have to do all of those. And security management requires security measurements. So we quickly talked about some security metrics, and that's one way of measuring security. So it can be either quantitative and qualitative. So when you look at a system, it can be assessed as very secure or moderately secure or less secure, not secure. That's quantitative value. Whereas, for example, you have measurements like mean time to failure. For example, for a server, that's going to be a specific number value that defines how long it may take for it to fail when an attack happens. Okay? But and there are a few other examples here, like risk, impact, probability, return on security investment, and so forth. In fact, there are quite a lot of metrics you can use in this context, depending on which perspective you're trying to look at. And this is also related to what you are interested in securing, and that will make you determine which metric will be probably the best to use. Okay. In typical scenario, measurement is difficult task. Why? You can think about it by pausing the video. Okay. So often measurement is very difficult task because it can be quite subjective. And for example, let's talk about probability. what is the probability that somebody is going to hack my computer today? Right? Probably very low, but you may think it's not a non-zero value. You may think it's a non-zero value, right? But when it actually happens, we don't know things like this. Okay, so there are some difficulties in actually matching some of the metrics we calculate back to real world, whether these numbers have a proper meaning to it. But we need to understand that what those numbers we calculate represents is a relative value. So when we implement additional security layers, then obviously it's going to impact how those values will change. And we can compare those to relatively measure how secure the system is. So what you can do is you can also go and measure the security of a well-defined systems. And when you implement your own one, compare those metrics, you get a good idea how secure or not secure your system is relative to these others. Okay. Security management has standards like ISO 27001. Okay, so there's maybe a new one. The last time I checked was last year. So, but basically, it specifies tasks associated with establishing, implementing, blah 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 of the security management system. So what it does is provide step-by-step guide on what you need to do at each step in order for you to achieve secure system, and that's part of the management stage. Okay. There are 14 clauses of security controls defined in this ISO. If we have a look, it kind of looks like this, starting from A5 to A18, like information security policies all the way down to compliances. So all of these things needs to be implemented in order to get the ISO security certificate. Okay. However, ISO is not the only one that's being used. There are some other security standards as well, but we may refer to ISO because it's an internationalized standard. But things like the US federal government information security standards like the NIST, or US Department of Defense information security standards like DoD. Okay? And all those, when you actually look inside what guidelines they provide, is quite similar. There's a lot of overlaps between those. But later, when you have to actually implement something like this, you should consult with your organization to see which one is the most suitable in that instance. Okay, and of course, there are more other international standards. The question might be asked is, which one should you follow? Well, I think I'll just leave that as the last question of this video. You can think about it, and you can also discuss with me if you're interested. All right, otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.